October 24, 1942, the Matanikau River, Guadalcanal. The jungle breathed in the darkness, not silence, never silence, but the wet, living pulse of the Solomon Islands at night. Tree frogs screamed their territorial claims, fruit bats swept overhead in rustling waves, and beneath it all, the low rumble of the Pacific surf breaking against black sand beaches 2 miles north. Along a shallow tributary feeding into the Matanikau, 840 United States Marines dug their foxholes into red volcanic soil that clung to entrenching tools like clay. The earth smelled of rot and iron, humidity wrapped around every man like a second skin. They did not speak much. Most were too exhausted. They had been fighting for 2 months on this miserable island, and their faces showed it. Gaunt, malarial, aged beyond their years. Private First Class Mitchell Page, a machine gunner from Pennsylvania coal country, tested his firing mechanism one last time as the last ray light bled from the sky. He did not know that in less than 6 hours he would be standing alone on a ridge, holding a Browning M1917 by its scalding barrel, firing into a human wave that refused to stop coming. This was not supposed to be where the war turned. Guadalcanal was a footnote on most maps, a malarial speck in the lower Solomons that few Americans could pronounce correctly. But in the autumn of 1942, it became the hinge upon which the entire Pacific campaign swung. The Japanese had landed there in May, carving an airstrip from the jungle to extend their reach toward Australia and sever the Allied supply line across the South Pacific. The Americans responded in August with the first major amphibious offensive of the war, Operation Watchtower, a desperate gamble thrown together with insufficient intelligence, inadequate supplies, and untested Marines who had trained for this moment on the beaches of North Carolina and the volcanic sands of New Zealand. They took the airstrip, renamed it Henderson Field. And then they learned what it meant to hold something the enemy wanted back. By late October, the Japanese had committed an entire division, the elite Sendai Division, veterans of China, Manchuria, and the Dutch East Indies, to retake the island. These were not the romanticized samurai of propaganda posters. They were professional soldiers hardened by a decade of continental warfare, trained in night infiltration tactics, and indoctrinated with the Bushido code that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor a man could achieve. Their commander, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, had promised his men they would be dining in the captured American mess halls within 72 hours. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? Japan had not lost a major land battle since the war began. The Marines were young, isolated, starving. Imperial intelligence estimated fewer than 600 defenders remained combat effective on the entire island. Maruyama's force numbered over 15,000. The mathematics seemed simple, brutal, but simple. What the Japanese did not account for was the arithmetic of desperation. The Marines on that ridge were not the well-fed, well-supplied juggernaut that would island hop across the Pacific in 1944 and 1945. They were skeletal. Rations had been cut to 2 meals a day, sometimes 1. Malaria ravaged whole companies. Dysentery left men too weak to lift their rifles. Resupply convoys fought through submarine-infested waters and only arrived sporadically. When they did arrive, the supplies were often the wrong items, winter uniforms shipped to a tropical hellscape, or crates of commemorative coins when what they needed was ammunition and quinine. The Japanese controlled the seas at night, shelling Henderson Field with such regularity that the Marines called the nightly bombardment Washing Machine Charlie after the irregular drone of the floatplanes that preceded the shelling. Men slept in their foxholes and woke to find half their platoon gone, vaporized by naval gunfire, or dragged screaming into the jungle by infiltrators. And yet they did not break. The Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle that October night expected to find exhaustion and collapse. They expected the Americans to fold under the weight of superior numbers and warrior spirit, just as the British had folded in Malaya, just as the Dutch had folded in Java. What they found instead in the early hours of October 25th was something their training had not prepared them for. A defense fueled not by imperial mandate, but by something rawer, more dangerous. It was the fighting withdrawal of men who had stopped expecting rescue and started expecting only to make the enemy pay in blood for every yard of ground. At 0200 hours, the first wave hit. They came without artillery preparation, without aerial bombardment, moving in near total silence until they were within grenade range. Then the night erupted. Japanese infantry poured up the ridgeline in massed formations, bayonets fixed, screaming, "Banzai, Marine you die!" In broken English meant to demoralize and confuse. They expected panic. They expected the Americans to abandon their positions and flee into the jungle. Instead, they met interlocking fields of fire from machine gun nests that had been sighted with cold, mathematical precision. The Browning M1917 was a water-cooled, belt-fed monster that could fire 500 rounds per minute and sustain that rate until the barrel glowed white. The Marines had 21 of them on that ridge. In the hands of men who had lived with these weapons for months, who had field-stripped them in the rain and test-fired them in the dark, they became instruments of industrial slaughter. The first assault broke against the Marine line like surf against a seawall. Bodies piled in front of the barbed wire. Japanese officers rallied their men and sent them forward again. And again. The Marines held. Then the second wave came. Then the third. By 0400 hours, portions of the line had been overrun. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the foxholes, entrenching tools against bayonets, rifle butts against swords. Page's machine gun position was hit by a grenade that killed his entire crew. He found himself alone on the ridge with a weapon too hot to hold and a belt of ammunition still feeding into the chamber. He wrapped his hands in his shirt and kept firing. When that gun jammed, he grabbed another from a dead gunner and kept firing. When Japanese soldiers closed to within yards, he lifted the 40-pound machine gun from its tripod and fired it from the hip, walking forward into the attack, a one-man countercharge that stopped an entire company cold. This was not heroism as the propaganda films depicted it. There were no soaring violins, no slow-motion sacrifices with noble last words. It was ugly, exhausting, mechanical. Men fired until their ammunition ran out, then threw grenades until those ran out, then fought with knives and rocks and helmets. They held because there was nowhere to retreat to. Henderson Field was 2 miles behind them. If the Japanese took that airstrip, the entire American position on Guadalcanal would collapse. Resupply would become impossible. Reinforcement would become impossible. The island would fall, and with it, the first offensive action the United States had taken in the Pacific. So they held. Not because they were invincible, but because the alternative was unthinkable. As dawn broke on October 25th, the jungle revealed the price. The slopes below the Marine positions were carpeted with bodies, hundreds of them tangled in barbed wire, sprawled across muddy tracks, stacked in ditches where machine gun fire had caught them in enfilade. Japanese wounded cried out for water. American corpsmen, moving through the carnage, treated enemy soldiers alongside their own, a reflex of training and exhaustion that shocked some of the Japanese prisoners. They had been told the Americans took no prisoners, that capture meant torture and dishonor. Instead, they found teenagers from Iowa and Alabama wrapping their wounds and sharing canteen water that was itself rationed to a few ounces per man per day. This generosity, small, almost accidental, became a weapon more devastating than any machine gun. Throughout the war, Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to view Americans as soft, decadent, individualistic, to the point of cowardice. The narrative was reinforced by every propaganda ministry broadcast, every training manual, every officer's speech. Americans loved comfort. They would not endure hardship. They would not sacrifice for an abstract cause. But here, on this ridge, that narrative shattered. The Marines were starving, feverish, outnumbered 4-1, and they had not only held, they had counterattacked, and when the shooting stopped, they had shared their water. For many Japanese soldiers, this was the first crack in the ideological armor they had worn since childhood. The realization came slowly in prison camps and hospital wards in the quiet moments after surrender. The Americans were not weak. They were terrifyingly competent, and their strength did not come from imperial edict or divine mandate. It came from something else, something they had been taught to despise but could not help but recognize. It came from a system that valued the individual life enough to train every man to think, to adapt, to lead when leadership was needed. Japanese infantry doctrine relied on rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience. American doctrine relied on initiative. When a Marine lieutenant was killed, the sergeant took over. When the sergeant was killed, the corporal took over. The chain of command did not break, it flexed. The second night was worse. Maruyama, refusing to accept defeat, committed his reserves. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers attacked the same ridge on the night of October 25th, determined to succeed through sheer mass where tactics had failed. The Marines, down to fewer than 800 combat-effective men, many of them wounded, faced another 12 hours of massed infantry assault. They rationed their ammunition down to the last belt. They fired their machine guns in short, disciplined bursts to conserve barrels that were already worn smooth. They called in artillery from batteries miles away, walking the shells so close to their own positions that shrapnel rained into the foxholes. And they held. By the morning of October 26th, the Sendai Division had lost over 2,000 men on that ridge. Maruyama withdrew. The offensive, the grand plan to retake Henderson Field and drive the Americans into the sea, collapsed. The Marines buried their dead and counted their ammunition. 60 dead, over 100 wounded, and 840 men who had redefined what it meant to hold a line. In the years that followed, Japanese veterans of Guadalcanal would speak carefully about what they learned in that jungle. Some, like the historian and former soldier Saburo Sakai, wrote that the Americans did not fight like an empire. They fought like men defending something they believed in, and that belief made them unpredictable, adaptable, and ultimately unbeatable. The logistics that allowed those Marines to hold, the ammunition resupplied under fire, the artillery support coordinated through crackling radios, the air cover from Henderson Field that appeared at dawn, all of it reflected a system designed not around honor, but around winning. And winning, they learned, was a more powerful ideology than dying well. There was one object that appeared in nearly every Marine memoir from Guadalcanal, mentioned so often it became almost symbolic, the sea ration can, the small olive-drab tin that contained a single meal's worth of beans or hash or stew. It was not glorious. The food inside was often bland, sometimes spoiled, occasionally inedible, but it represented something profound. It represented a nation that could afford to package individual meals for every soldier in the field, that could ship those meals across 6,000 miles of ocean, and that considered the life of a private worth the industrial effort required to keep him fed. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal subsisted on rice and whatever they could forage. Officers received slightly larger portions. Enlisted men often went days without eating. When they overran American positions, they found foxholes stocked with rations, cigarettes, and medical supplies. Some wept, others ate until they were sick. All of them understood in that moment the terrible truth their commanders had hidden from them. They were not losing to warriors, they were losing to a machine, a vast industrial empire that valued its soldiers enough to feed them, heal them, and replace them when they fell. October 26, 1942 did not end the battle for Guadalcanal. The island would not be secured until February of the following year. The Japanese would launch more offensives, more night attacks, more desperate banzai charges. But something had shifted. The inevitability was gone. The myth of Japanese invincibility had died on a muddy ridge in the Solomons, killed by 840 Marines who refused to believe they were supposed to lose. What remains when the scholarship is closed and the memorials visited is a simple, enduring image: a young man in a foxhole, hands blistered and bleeding, feeding a belt of ammunition into a machine gun that should have failed hours ago, holding a line that should have broken, defending an airstrip on an island most Americans could not find on a map. He held because the man beside him held. And they held because somewhere deep in the exhausted logic of men pushed past endurance, they understood that what they defended was not just an airstrip or an island. It was the idea that a system built on individual worth could outlast a system built on collective sacrifice. That abundance was stronger than austerity. That free men fighting for something they chose to believe in would always, always outfight men dying because they were told to. The jungle has reclaimed the ridge now. Vines cover the foxholes, rust consumes the barbed wire, but the lesson remains carved into the history of that war and every war since. Freedom, when defended by those who understand its value, is the most ferocious force on earth.